The pain of childbirth. Can Christian hope alleviate the sufferings of mortal life? Bruce Charlton. Because being a Christian is essentially about resurrected eternal heavenly life beyond mortal death, it may seem that, even if it were assumed to be a real and attainable possibility, this is not of any help in helping people deal with the sufferings of this mortal life. And, after all, it is this life and its suffering that presses most strongly upon us, in a day-by-day, minute-by-minute way. What most people most want is help. Now. It seems on the surface that another life after this life cannot be of any genuine assistance. We must still live through all the miseries and pains, and perhaps for many years, before attaining the transformed state in a deathless and good situation. However, this understanding is mistaken, because resurrected eternal heavenly life creates a larger context, that transforms what went before, both by expectation, as well as in retrospect. What I mean can be illustrated by the pains of childbirth. To generalize, giving birth, especially for the first time, is often extremely painful. It is often about as painful as anything can be, genuine agony, and this may continue for hours. Although, of course, medical technology nowadays provides methods for alleviating this pain. And this is when things go well. Unless you have experienced, or been present at, such a childbirth, you probably don't believe me, or think I am exaggerating ridiculously. You probably think, if childbirth was really as painful as all that, then surely I would know about it. Surely people would go on about it more than they do. Well, the point is that, when childbirth is anticipated positively, the baby is wanted, and goes well, and a healthy baby ultimately arrives, then people more or less forget about how painful the process had been. More exactly, they don't forget so much as put the pain into the context of having a baby. The pain happened by the way, almost as a means to that end. The pain of having a baby, even while it is happening, happens as part of, and en route to, a desired destination. In other words, the occurrence of childbearing pain is contextualized by its meaning and result, and this has a powerful influence both during, as well as after, the agonies of giving birth. To understand the power of such a context, consider that the same amount of pain which happens in childbirth would have a very different, and much worse, indeed, traumatizing, significance, if it were deliberately inflicted in the course of torture. The pain of torture would be worse both at the time, and also worse in recollection, than the same pain happening in a childbirth context. Again, assuming the baby was wanted, and was all right when born. To close the analogy, this is like the effect of resurrected eternal life on the sufferings of mortal life. Having the destination of heaven as a purpose, has a transformative effect on the meaning, hence the experience, of suffering during mortal life. Transformative both during suffering, and also when looking back from resurrected life on that suffering. This does not make the pain of life go away, any more than the childbirth context prevents the pain being very painful indeed. However, the meaning of pain is part of the suffering, and when the meaning of pain changes, the nature of the suffering changes. The reason why the pains of life are worse for modern people than it was during the ages of faith, is that for modern people pain has no meaning, because an atheist materialist life has no purpose. Pain without purpose is pain without meaning, so pain without purpose is experienced as pure suffering. The pains and sufferings of mortal life are far too many and too various for there ever to be any possibility of preventing or curing them all, and some causes of suffering are innate, and intractable to the human condition. Therefore we should not consider Christianity as if it were a supposed painkiller, nor as a preventive or therapy for the sufferings of mortal life. However, our mortal life, including its pains, is given purpose and therefore meaning by the desired destination, by personal positive transformation, resurrection, and the heavenly life to come. And this affects our experience of suffering in mortal life while it is happening, as well as in retrospect. The sunk cost fallacy in religion. Bruce Charlton. This is because we, the group with whom I identify, have, over many past generations, sunk so much effort, resources, sufferings into such and such aspects of the religion. Therefore I/now cannot possibly conclude that such activities and actions are here and now useless, or harmful. Poor little me all alone, versus all so many, so great them. If I did, then I, little me, all by myself, would be saying that all that effort/resources/suffering was a mistake. I would be rejecting and cutting myself off from the justly great and venerable ancestors who made and sustained my religion. I would be putting my poor little self above all them great and good. And thus people paint themselves into a corner of despair, hopelessness, and apostasy. Because the religion of the ancestors does not work anymore. Indeed, the poor little I secretly, secret from itself, mostly, regards the religion of the ancestors and of the strong majority as, in some important respects, well, flawed. Badly flawed. The secret heart cries out against it, against some of the things some of my ancestors believed and did, so sincerely, so earnestly, for such sustained periods. But, anyway, whatever they thought/said/did, fact is, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work. They don't really believe it, but they are painted into a corner of that or nothing. Thus Christianity is weakened, and thus people reject Christianity. It is their own fault. If we find ourselves painted into a corner, trapped by convictions into hopelessness, the first step towards escape is to recognize that we are actively doing this to ourselves. By our own timidity, our fear, and lack of courage, and mental laziness. And fundamental, ultimate, irresponsibility, the deep propensity, so common nowadays, to want to blame others for our predicament. Nobody can compel anyone else to give up this existential persecutory delusion, because it is consoling in the short term, even as it is spiritually lethal in the longer term. And vast swathes of people in the world, whole nations, races, ethnicities, ideologies, are in the grip of chosen resentment and other blame, including many powerful, rich and prestigious people, and groups, people who we, poor little me, would really like to have on our side. People think, my life would be so much easier and pleasanter and more secure, if I was part of a strong gang. People are trapped by their own self-imposed and self-interested assumptions, and by their own fear, resentment, and despair. They reject any help that requires them to be courageous, active, and spiritually autonomous. Which is why such people cannot be helped, if they do not help themselves first. The Easter problem, the fake virtue of humility, and the false ideals of obedience and altruism. Bruce Charlton. Easter seems to be a time when the confusion, incoherence, and errors of mainstream Christianity become most evident, as mainstream Christianity finds ever more way of being wrong, of misdirecting attention, and sowing confusion. Perhaps one root of this is the UN Christ-like, fake virtue of humility. This leads to the preaching of two kinds of error. 1. Unselfish ego-annihilating obedience to God's will. 2. Unselfish altruism. Mainstream Christians are always saying things on the lines that all good which they enact is not from me, but from God in me. They claim that the highest Christian aim is for us to become nothing but a channel for God to work through. As a commenter put it, "I did nothing on my own, God did everything." Christians repeat this without considering its implication that such an attitude depicts humans as unthinking and utterly obedient slaves of deity, and what is worse, slaves to the kind of God who wants humans to desire nothing higher than to cease being themselves, and instead become mere tools. Such an attitude ultimately renders the creation of free and creative men utterly futile, a divine mistake. Mainstream Christians are always preaching that we cease to be selfish and instead live to serve, that we ought to set aside considerations of self-interest, and instead help other people. But this is merely utilitarian atheistic materialism under a Christian disguise. Of course, it can easily be seen what the preachers are getting at. They are trying to combat sins such pride and lust. But the problem is that humility just isn't a virtue, and indeed is something close to the worst possible attitude to inculcate in a pervasively evil world of totalitarian domination of all social institutions, including the mainstream religions and churches. The opposite of pride is not anti-pride, the opposite of selfishness is not doing what other people want, or need. The opposite of psychopathic gratification is not to become a non-person, one with God, a hollowed husk in human shape, an instrument rather than a divine Son of God, and a participant in divine creation. To recommend humility and living for the benefit of other people, is therefore to preach something other than what Jesus did and taught. It is to preach another religion. There are religions that are rooted in the oneness of God and the delusional unreality of the self. There is a religion based on negation of the self, and absolute submission to God's will. But these are not Christianity. From a Christian point of view, to recommend humility and altruism is, in the context of the West in 2026, pretty much to guarantee a chosen damnation via assimilation to evil societal norms. Instead, the proper virtues by which to resist sins such as pride, selfish short-termism and so forth, are the Christian virtues. Love of Jesus in thanks for his divine creation of heaven, and his continuing guidance and comfort, faith in his offer of the possibility of resurrected eternal life beyond death, and confident hope that this shall be our personal destination. Strong individual motivation cannot be scaled up. Bruce Charlton. Amidst our civilization characterized by extremely weak motivation, probably the weakest in the history of the world, there are individuals who are strongly motivated. But these commonly make the mistake of assuming that their own personal motivation is something that can be scaled up, the mistake of assuming that, what motivates me is something that could, and perhaps should, motivate the masses. Yet each individual who has reached a situation of being highly motivated, has reached that position as a consequence of an unique spiritual journey, starting out with different innate character, abilities, situation, and then following a trajectory determined by previous choices and particular circumstances. There is really nothing to suggest that this unique pathway, or its particular endpoint, ought to be, or could be, an effective template for motivating everybody else. Nor even that any number of such personal odysseys will add up or average to a formula for mass motivation. Quite the contrary, all actually existing group-level motivations continue to be extremely feeble and to decline, no matter when or if individuals within these groups are genuinely powerfully motivated. Of course, it is impossible to prevent highly motivated individuals from assuming that some future mass and motivated group can be extrapolated from his own experience. But in practice such assertions will continue to be treated as idiosyncratic, as eccentricities or hobby horses. Because what worked for him, almost certainly, will not work for me. There are just too many differences. So, we shall, and increasingly, have small numbers of highly motivated individuals, but not highly motivated groups. And, if we are to have realistic optimism, it will need to depend on a confidence that individual persons operating alone, in a material sense, can indeed make a positive overall difference. In other words, confidence, for a better word, depends on the reality of the spiritual, and its ultimate domination of the material. Of Lions and Lambs. William Wildblood. We are living through the end times when spirit is obscured by matter, as a result of which even when the spiritual is acknowledged it is often perceived through the distorting lens of modernity. One of the characteristics of the end times is that the whole era returns as part of a general summing up of the age, but it does so in a form that is misrepresented by the reigning characteristics of the zeitgeist. Thus, we now have access to spiritual traditions of the past in a way undreamt of not long ago, but what we have access to are really only the bones on which we frequently put modern flesh. An example of this is paganism, which appears to be making a comeback in various forms. One particular form has come about in response to the feminization of modern Christianity, and the perception that it is a Jewish religion. The idea is that adopting a foreign religion has weakened the West as a whole and men in particular, and if you look at the Christian religion as it is today, you can see there is truth in this. The new Archbishop of Canterbury makes it almost comically obvious. However, if you look more deeply, the picture changes somewhat. To begin with, despite appearances, Christianity is not a Jewish religion. Obviously, it was born in a Jewish setting, but Christ transcended that, which was why the Jews rejected him. And then when the religion took root in the West, it was transformed by its host, to reflect the sensibility of Western thought and behavior. The supposed feminine nature of Christianity is only because it shows the way to go beyond the egotistic self. Christianity has become feminized over recent years, but that is not its real nature. There is nothing feminine about Christ nor his disciples, who all fought and conquered the world, but did so through force of spirit rather than force of arms. Nonetheless, because Christianity has become a bland, non-judgmental religion with its idea of love, originally fiery, become wet and soggy, it is not surprising that a more masculine mindset rejects it. Yet those who do reject Christianity for its supposed weakness are not seeing it as it is, only as it has become. Reacting against the soft and sentimental side of modern Christianity, some men adopt hard pagan beliefs in which self-mastery is key. Your mind must master your emotions, they say, if you are to be the master of yourself. They are right. The mind must master the emotions, or you remain a slave like most of humanity. And yet, is this spirituality, or is it self-development? Are you going beyond the self, or are you reinforcing it? It is easy to mistake self-development for spirituality. There is overlap, but the former is only a preliminary phase, and problems arise when it is seen as an end in itself. The resurgence of masculinity often goes with bodybuilding and working out at the gym, but then these become ends in themselves, narcissistic ends. Its advocates want success and achievement and to make a mark in the world, and while these are part of human development, especially male development, they are not spiritual things. The self should be strong, but it is an error to regard that as a spiritual state. It is only a foundation and it needs refinement, and to learn sacrifice or it will degenerate. Action and reaction are always equal and opposite. We should not allow the absurdities of the left, of feminism, of anti-racism and all the rest of the crazy catalogue of errors Western man has built up over the years, to lead to an excessive response. There are signs this is happening, and I suspect the only thing that can keep us on the straight and narrow path, the razor's edge of true spirituality that combines both lion and lamb, is the risen Christ. Happy Easter. The significance of Good Friday. Bruce Charlton. For me, the significance of Good Friday is that this was when Jesus died, which he needed to do in order to complete, his core mission. He did not need to die in the way he did, because any mode of death would suffice, and death was inevitable one way or another, sooner or later, for Jesus as for all mortal men. But Jesus did need to die, in order to resurrect, and ascend to heaven. I believe that heaven as a state of being already existed before Jesus died, and that Lazarus was probably its first inhabitant, albeit Lazarus returned to dwell on earth, for a while. But in order for everybody who thenceforth desired resurrection and eternal life to be able to achieve these, Jesus himself needed to die, be resurrected, ascend. That salvation for everybody includes those who had died before the time of Jesus, and who resided as spirits in Sheol/Hades, or had reincarnated, or were ghosts, or even demons who were not fully corrupted. Which is what the harrowing of hell on Easter Saturday represents in a symbolic but distorted fashion. Mary Magdalene at the tomb and after, two presumed later excisions from Easter Sunday in the fourth Gospel. Bruce Charlton.
John 20, 1-16. The first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Then she runneth, and cometh to Simon Peter, and to the other disciple, whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. So they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre. And he stooping down, and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin, that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw, and believed. For as yet they knew not the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again unto their own home. But Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down, and looked into the sepulchre, and seeth two angels in white sitting, the one at the head, and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. And they say unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? She saith unto them, Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back, and saw Jesus standing, and knew not that it was Jesus. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? She, supposing him to be the gardener, saith unto him, Sir, if thou have borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus saith unto her, Mary. She turned herself, and saith unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. Jesus saith unto her, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren, and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father, and your Father, and to my God, and your God. Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things unto her.
It seems evident that there is something missing between Master and Jesus saith, because we have no explanation as to what Jesus meant by touch me not, in a context that the gospel is nearly always self-explanatory and indeed detailed with respect to observed, recorded or experienced action, such as the detailed descriptions of how the author and Simon Peter ran to the tomb, and what they saw. And also because I am prepared to assume further excisions, and insertions, by a later hand, in the, not very many, as a proportion, other places where the gospel is not self-explanatory, nor is poetic in form. And then there is the fact that the gospel, as we have it, leaves Mary unaccounted for, having been so very important throughout, her story is just left hanging. This is marked as my inferred second excision. But I think it can be inferred what is missing in these instances, and why. Such inference is derived from the basis of an assumed fact that Mary was married to Jesus, and that the fourth gospel tells us this by implication in several places. But later hands have removed all explicit references to this, for what may be theological reasons. Presumably they were deleted on the basis of assuming that, because the Mary relationship was, later, regarded as theologically impossible, such references must themselves have been erroneous. Somewhat as I wrote, the exchange of words between Jesus and Mary at the tomb may imply that she would join the risen Jesus after he had ascended. Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father means, therefore, stop touching me just now, we will be able to touch one another when I am ascended. After all, it wasn't forbidden to touch Jesus, doubting Thomas was invited to. My inference is that Mary touched Jesus in some fashion as a wife would touch him, but this was not correct or appropriate until after the ascension, until after their ascension. Then Jesus describes his ascension unto my Father, and your Father, and to my God, and to your God. Such a very specific form of address, the reiterated symmetry of my your, is appropriate to the wife of Jesus, in the sense that God the Father has become Mary's father-in-law, and her God, in the same kind of direct and personal way as for Jesus. So, we are being told, by Mary's brother Lazarus, author of the fourth gospel, that Mary Magdalene ascended to God to be with her divine husband. However, it seems, I assume, that such further explicit and explanatory reference to Mary Magdalene was deleted by some later hand. I also assume that this gospel reference was removed because seen as contradicting metaphysical philosophical, but not genuinely Jesus-derived, assumptions of a Trinitarian and monotheistic nature, assumptions that seemed to entail that Jesus could not have been married. Or maybe that, even if Jesus was married, this could be of no theological significance, i.e. marriage could have no relevance to Jesus' divine work. At any rate, when marriage to Mary Magdalene is not regarded as by prior assumption impossible, and when the fourth gospel is acknowledged as our first, only eyewitness, and most authoritative source, then the Good Friday encounter between Mary and the risen Jesus at the tomb emerges as of something close to primary significance in our understanding of Jesus' life and work. Our yearning for a life of continual enchantment. Bruce Charlton. The romantic search for an escape from the mundane nature of life in this world, that is, for enchantment, takes many, many forms, and is pursued by different people in widely varying ways. A very incomplete list of the themes would include by religions, spiritualities ideologies, through reading, TV and movies, by personal relationships such as intense friendships and sexual relationships, through the appreciation and making of crafts and arts, by meditative, paranormal and supernatural encounters and experiences, via drink and drugs and other derangements, by holidays and travel, pursuit of personal or formal education, from performing drama and music, and so on. Fully considered, there are only a few people who are not implicitly pursuing the enchanted life. All of these methods and others are at least somewhat effective and may lead to enchantment, for some people, to some extent, and temporarily. Because with time and the changes in ourselves, all methods and pursuits always lose effect. The once enchanted becomes mundane. In other words, in our failure to become and to stay enchanted, we are here dealing with the ultimate fact of entropy. We are up against the inescapability of entropy in this world we all inhabit. We are up against this primary creation where all changes, loss is inevitable, and everything ends in its death. But this world and primary creation is not all, because, by Jesus Christ, we all have the opportunity to undergo the transformation of resurrection after death through following Jesus, and move on to the second creation that is heaven, where the state of enchantment is everlasting. It is the state of everlasting enchantment in heaven that Jesus is describing in the fourth gospel, when he uses metaphorical examples such as water, food and meat, and compared the inevitabilities of their incomplete, temporary, entropic nature in this life now, with the eternally present and gratifying fulfillment in the life to come. Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. But my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live for ever. I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Labour not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. When Jesus says that he brings life, life everlasting, eternal life, people nowadays wrongly interpret this as meaning an offer of, merely, continuing mundane life, the mere persistence forever of life as we now know it. Merely the continuance of this entropic life. But heaven comes after resurrection, and resurrection is a transformation by which not only evil, but also entropy, is eliminated. Or, to put matters positively, when all the denizens of heaven have made a permanent commitment to live forever wholly by love of God and divine creation and their fellow resurrected humans, and other resurrected beings. Then this is a situation both of eternal goodness, and also of everlasting enchantment. Just as we can now, in this mortal life, know the desire for a wholly good world, without evil, but we cannot attain it. And Christians know that full goodness can only be attained after death and by resurrection. So also we can know that our yearning for a life of continual and complete enchantment, without entropic change, decline, annihilation, while impossible to achieve here and now, is attainable. But attainable after our death, and by resurrection. The future of spiritual effort, means and ends. Bruce Charlton. First religions, then later spiritual systems, always demand effort of some kind, but the nature of effort could be very different. Maybe these could be termed relaxation versus concentration, which corresponds approximately to contemplation versus imagination. At various times in my life I tried to follow both of these distinct paths, of opening versus closing the mind. However, the distinction between these is blurred by the potential difference between means and ends, because there is often an implicit assumption that we can or should pursue one kind of end by a training of another kind, whereby the means is distinct from the end. My assumptions is that originally the means and ends were identical, that an immersive and contemplative spirituality, such as that of our nomadic tribal ancestors, and still of young children, is something that people just do. Means and ends are identical. But when religion became established, it became usual to pursue contemplative spiritual ends by means of rigorous, prolonged, and intensive training that was not, of itself, contemplative and spiritual. In summary, a person would learn a symbolic and ritual system, would learn its proper meanings and responses, and by effort, concentration, and repetition would learn to experience the desired subjective and imaginative responses. The goal is that an individual develops a new kind of spontaneity, so there is an element of paradox, or even contradiction in the fact that the means are often dry and mundane, while the endpoint aimed at is transcendent. This is the nature of traditional religion. Even at its best and highest, there is a necessary alienation and functionality and mechanical experience that is sacrificed in order that for each individual at some times and places, or a minority of people for most of the time, there can be a spiritual participation with the divine. Thus we pay for the spiritual, with the secular, as individuals, and socially. For example, several peasants' mundane labor pays for each monk's spiritual experience. I have a strong intuition that the future of spiritual effort is one in which we return to the primal situation, in which means and ends are again identical, in which what we need to do here and now is exactly the same as what we are aiming to do in future. Finding the Black Swan, a favorite study from my empirical researches. Bruce Charlton. Much of my work as a scientist was theoretical in nature, but I published quite a few empirical, i.e. experimental and observational or statistical, papers as well. One particular favorite of mine, and which seems to have been somewhat influential too, was done with a student called Florence Wollstone, who was intercalating a Bachelor of Science degree into her medical studies, and who did the actual legwork and analysis, and Richard Blennerhassett, a clinical psychiatrist, who provided access to the subjects studied. I liked this paper because it was as clear an example of Black Swan type, Karl Popper-esque, research as one is likely to find in medicine. So, what do I mean by Black Swan in relation to science? Well, to state the matter more softly than did Popper, who wrongly regarded it as logically definitive of science, the idea is that it is not possible to prove positively the hypothesis that all swans are white by gathering observations of white swans, no matter how many examples of white swans that we discovered and counted. But it may be possible to disprove negatively the hypothesis that all swans are white, by finding even just a single example of a black swan. In other words, if there is one black swan, then all swans cannot be white. The asymmetry of this logic, the power of that single necessary observation, is recognized by using the definite article the, in referring to the black swan whom we ought to be seeking. In this research, we aimed to refute the theory that persecutory, also called paranoid, delusions are caused by defective theory of mind ability. In other words, that when someone falsely and firmly believed that he was being persecuted by some person or group of people, this was caused by a fault in his ability to infer the thought and intentions of those other. The hypothesis was implicitly that all people with persecutory delusions must exhibit defective theory of mind ability. All we needed to do was find a single clear and unambiguous example of a person with persecutory delusions but with normal theory of mind, and we had found our black swan and refuted the hypothesis. So, to refute this theory, we sought out examples of people who did have definite persecutory delusions, but did not have anything wrong with their theory of mind ability. On the basis that if someone actually suffered persecutory delusions yet also displayed normal theory of mind functioning, then the delusions couldn't be caused by defective theory of mind. Theory of mind, persecutory delusions and the somatic marker mechanism. Florence Wollstone, Richard C. Blennerhassett, Bruce G. Charlton. Cognitive Neuropsychiatry. Introduction. Pure cases of persecutory delusions can be interpreted as theory of mind delusions, using a model that equates the theory of mind mechanism with the somatic marker mechanism, as described by Damasio and colleagues. 3 predictions were tested in a case study design: that pure cases of persecutory delusions could be found, that such cases would retain normal theory of mind reasoning abilities, and that delusions would be encapsulated to a specific group of persecutors with hostile intentions. Method: The caseload of 17 psychiatrists and 4 community psychiatric nurses was surveyed for pure cases of persecutory delusions. Cases were excluded when there was evidence of other psychopathology, intellectual impairment, abnormal reasoning, psychotic features, or diagnostic syndromes. Selected cases were evaluated for the scope of their delusional beliefs and the nature of their social relationships using a detailed semi-structured interview that was transcribed verbatim, and putative theory of mind tests as devised by Corcoran and Frith. Results: 34 potential cases were referred, among which 4 pure cases of encapsulated persecutory delusions were eligible for the study. All were men, aged between 32 and 43. Apart from their persecutory delusions, cases were free from other detectable pathology in their reasoning processes, affect, or social interactions, and scored highly on the putative theory of mind tests. Identified persecutors were males, and delusions involved false beliefs concerning the threat of violence from gangs of strangers. Conclusions: pure cases of severe but encapsulated persecutory delusions can be found, and such cases demonstrate intact theory of mind reasoning ability. The nature of persecutory delusions is understandable in terms of the somatic marker mechanism, and the content of delusions is consistent with the nature of hostile threats to men in the ancestral human environment. In sum, Florence found, interviewed and tested not 1 but 4 black swans, actually 5, but 1 withdrew consent to being included in the write-up. The black swans, being men, had such severe persecutory delusions as to have required admission to a psychiatric ward, yet who passed the theory of mind tests with flying colors. That is, 5 men with severe persecutory delusions who demonstrated no measurable, or indeed interpersonal, conversational, evidence of impairment in their ability to infer the motivations of other people. In simple terms, outside of the specific subject of their severe delusion, these men thought and reasoned normally, so far as we could judge. From which it seems reasonable to infer negatively that all persecutory delusions are not caused by defective theory of mind abilities, although, of course, some persecutory delusions might nonetheless have this cause. Note: in practice, a single observation will very seldom have this power, usually argued on the basis that the black swan is either not really black, or else not really a swan. Subversive/gimmicky UK coinage is a sure symptom of civilizational self-destruction. Bruce Charlton. I can't remember exactly when it was, 20 years ago, maybe, that the Royal Mint decided to start making a jigsaw from UK coinage, such that each lower denomination coin made no sense, because the tail side was henceforth just a fragment from a larger picture. Given the symbolism and core historical function of coinage, such a childish gimmick was clear evidence of the covert self-loathing of the establishment, and of the purposively self-destroying motivation of that Western civilization in which Great Britain played a foundational role. This is the mockery of a servile managerial class who have given up even the pretense of legitimate authority, and instead express their sense of smug superiority to the masses by sneering, subversion, and stunts. Architecture, a deeply flawed concept. Bruce Charlton. There are certainly exceptions, but most of the best buildings in the history of the world were built by members of craft guilds, such as masons, and without architects. And, for sure, over the past century since Art Deco, architecture has had a powerfully malign influence. The deliberate anti-beautiful impulse of the past century of architects is evident from the difference between the housing of recent domestic buildings, which are merely practical without beauty, and those that were architect-designed with big budgets. Or, at least, houses were mostly functional, until the allegedly anti-carbon and environmental regulations began to inflict complex, expensive dysfunctionality on all construction work. Whereas the large, showcase, private and public buildings, those that employ high-status architectural corporations or individuals, are anti-aesthetic, anti-human, anti-God monstrosities. Such that the purposive, actively evil turn of our civilization is advertised explicitly, unambiguously, indeed shamelessly, more by its architecture than by almost anything else. The Centre for UK Surveillance and Blackmail, GCHQ. Evidently, not a nice organisation. The Fight Against Evil. William Wildblood. Early on in my spiritual instruction I was told that the more progress I made the more I would be assailed by evil in all its forms. We know from the lives of the saints that as they advance on the path towards God they are increasingly attacked by the demonic forces, and we can conjecture this is so because every person who escapes the dominion of those forces weakens their power. The general populace can be corrupted by general corruption, but those seeking release from the net of this world require special attention. God allows this to take place because it tempers the soul. Unto the pure all things are pure. Evil can only work on us by bringing out our own weaknesses, but when they are brought out into the open they can be dealt with if we are honest, alert and true, and if we turn to God for help. Greater progress equals increased attack. How does this work? One might think that evil thoughts and desires that arise in one's mind show one's own sinful nature, and they might do. But they might also be put there. In dreams, for instance, we might encounter horrible things, but this does not necessarily mean these things arise from our own subconscious and are somehow unresolved parts of our own nature. They might be, but they might also be a demonic assault. Attack might come from outside and other people, but it more often comes from within our own mind, and we must learn to recognize it and see it for what it is. Then we just don't react to it. We don't fight it because that gives it energy and attention. We simply ignore it. Evil in all its forms, they said. Evil has many forms. Obvious evil is obvious. We can easily recognize it, but the devil is a trickster. He can lure us down a path of sin through apparent good. How many people have thought they were fighting for God and truth when they had been deceived into following their own desires or had adopted an idol of their own making as God? The devil has corrupted whole religions in this way, not to mention political ideologies, and he can certainly corrupt us on an individual level if we are not alive to the possibility. We might think we are serving God when we are really just serving ourselves. Evil attacks at our weakest points, and these are often aspects of our character of which we are unaware. In a way, the whole spiritual path is the fight against evil, which really means against our own fallen nature. The temptations that came to Christ on the mountaintop will come to all of us eventually, though perhaps not in such a dramatic fashion. The way to deal with them is as Christ did. Submit yourself to God and keep Him as your only goal. What makes a real saint is conquering evil. Imagine a saint who never knew evil, who was always sweetly loving. Isn't that rather a shallow thing? What gives depth and wisdom and nobility is fighting and conquering evil within oneself. Someone who has never known evil can never be a saint. Does this mean evil is part of God's plan? I don't know, but I do know He uses it to make good even better. He's clever that way. This world is for those who choose to follow Jesus. Bruce Charlton. This world is for those who choose to follow Jesus. Follow literally, that is, follow Jesus to resurrected eternal life in heaven. But for everyone else, this world really is that meaningless and miserable waste of time which modern culture supposes it to be. Yet for those who shall follow Jesus, no matter how small and obscure they may seem to be, insofar as it was loving and creative, mortal life will be known in retrospect to be an endlessly challenging, exciting, and heroic business. Traditional Christianity damns marriage by dubious comparisons, faint praise, and pragmatic functionality. Bruce Charlton. In a world where marriage has been, over several generations, purposively and systematically weakened, subverted, and finally rendered meaningless, it is tempting to yearn for the comparative situation of traditional Christian marriage, for its legal clarity and moral strictness. Yet the Christian churches, excepting the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have, in my opinion, seriously trivialized the spiritual potential of marriage. And for a very long time. I take my example from the Book of Common Prayer, the Church of England's solemnization of marriage.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, and in the face of this congregation, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate, instituted of God in the time of man's innocency, signifying unto us the mystical union that is betwixt Christ and his church.
This is absurd. To justify marriage between two individual persons in terms of a, to my mind, exceedingly dubious and opaque comparison with a supposed mystical union between Christ and his church. This is to explain the simple with the complex, the experiential with abstraction, the clear with the opaque. I cannot imagine that anybody who was doubtful about the validity or necessity of marriage would be persuaded by this, or would even understand what was meant by it. The analogy merely opens a can of worms rather than explaining anything. After all, what is this supposed mystical union of Christ and Church, which does not feature in the fourth Gospel? Exactly who is the MU between, I mean, what counts as his church, and what is excluded? To be specific, which actual people of which particular church can confidently be asserted to be parts of this mystical union? And given the gross corruption and dissent of all the Christian churches, who and what self-identified Christian institutions, and which parts of which institutions, ought to be ignored, and in what respects?
Which holy estate Christ adorned and beautified with his presence, and first miracle that he wrought, in Cana of Galilee.
This is bizarre. Is it seriously suggested that the institutions of marriage is justified because Jesus attended a wedding, and there performed a miracle? Using such an argument, all sorts of things might be justified.
And is commended of St. Paul to be honorable among all men.
Commended by St. Paul. Well, if at all, only in the most grudging and negative way. Paul regards celibacy as the highest state, and did not allow marriage any positive spiritual value.
And therefore is not by any to be enterprised, nor taken in hand, unadvisedly, lightly, or wantonly, to satisfy men's carnal lusts and appetites, like brute beasts that have no understanding, but reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly, and in the fear of God, duly considering the causes for which matrimony was ordained.
Prudent advice, and nothing to disagree with here, but it would apply to life in general, for example eating and drinking, and any major life decisions, like choosing a job or purchasing a house, and does not help explain why marriage might be a good thing.
First, it was ordained for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord, and to the praise of his holy name.
The difficulty is that this is first a biological justification merely, and secondly a sociological one, and alternative arrangements for procreation and raising children might be, and indeed are, proposed.
Secondly, it was ordained for a remedy against sin, and to avoid fornication, that such persons as have not the gift of continency might marry, and keep themselves undefiled members of Christ's body.
See above. This is an appalling non-justification, and contains the assumption that the avoiding sin, double negative theology, ought to be our primary motivations. If this were true, ultimately, it were better not to have been born, or to die before having the chance to sin.
Thirdly, it was ordained for the mutual society, help, and comfort, that the one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity.
unobjectionable, so far as it goes, but nothing spiritual about it, merely a matter of expediency, nothing to do with salvation or theosis. I regard such feeble advocacy and rationalization of marriage as a symptom of very deep and widespread spiritual problems. This represents a pitiful and significant inability to explain or advocate a thing that has been so obviously, for so many people, as one of the most wonderfully positive and desirable things in human existence. It strikes me as evidence of a grossly inadequate theology that, even rigorous and honest traditional Christian churches at their best have failed so badly to make explicit the spiritual value and desirability of something that has often been directly experienced and known.